Uh, Thank you, Skylar. Important topic. So important, not necessarily at all the same topic, but this idea of trying to reduce, we think about food. Food systems are incredibly important, and thinking about different ways to reduce our carbon footprint by, using every available pathway to reduce is also very important. Making policy is very important, but then figuring out how to actually communicate to stakeholders and also to reconcile what the legislative intent was versus what the impact of the policy should be, and then figure out what stakeholders are being asked to do in terms of adopting a certain policy. So basically taking something that's produced in Sacramento by a bunch of lawyers or other professionals elected to positions, and then ultimately taking very vague language and making it very, very specific and implementable and actually having an impact is very, very hard. So policy gestures and virtue signaling is easy, but implementable, actionable policy is very hard. And both of these projects, the Skylars both worked on, address that. And also, we're short on time and we have a long title here, so I'll introduce Skylar Enge, who also incredibly impressive performance in this program, also completed a Division I soccer season while here, which is incredibly impressive. And her project is Sectoral Roles in the United States Food Waste Reduction, Identifying Gaps in Food Waste Management, and Advancing Collaborative Solutions. Skylar, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Corey, and thank you, Skylar. I feel very lucky that we've been able to collaborate with very similar projects. Okay, so my name is also Skylar, and my project is on sector roles in U.S. food waste reduction, identifying gaps in food waste management, and advancing collaborative solutions. So just a little bit of background on the issue. The United States food system is incredibly inefficient, especially when it comes to food waste. And right now, the U.S. wastes about 1/3 of the food that we generate. And so not only is that the food that we're wasting, but it's also everything that goes into growing that food. So that's soil and arable land and water and labor and sunlight. And so all that's wasted. And in 2023 alone, we generated about 74 million tons of surplus food. So to put that into perspective, that surplus food has an economic value of about $330 billion. And that's enough to feed 120 billion people through meals. In addition to the economic value, food waste is also a major climate issue. And so each year, food loss and waste in the US emits about 170 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. And that's the same impact of driving 33 million cars on the road for an entire year. And so a big part of that comes from methane, and that's released when food decomposes in the landfill, and methane is an extremely potent greenhouse gas. So I was motivated to focus my project on food waste in the US because the US is such a high emitter of greenhouse gas emissions and also a high food wasting country. And so to address this, in 2015, the USDA and the EPA created a national food loss and waste reduction goal to curb food waste in landfills by the year 2030 in half. And so this was in an effort to address climate change, but also to increase food insecurity, economic efficiency, and also conserve energy. But the most recent data that we have in the US shows that since this national goal was established, food in the landfill has actually increased per person over time. And so 2030 is approaching very quickly, and it appears that we're very far from reaching this goal. So I was motivated to research this topic because preventing food waste from entering the landfill is really an incredible solution to significantly reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And so my hope for this project was to understand the gaps in food waste policy and why the US is so far from meeting this 2030 goal, and also to understand how the different sectors, so the private sector, nonprofit organizations, and then state and local government, how they can interact and coordinate to increase efforts so the US can meet this goal of having food waste by 2030. So I had 4 main research questions that guided my process. The first was looking at how waste is typically managed, so things like plastic jugs or aluminum cans, and how food waste has a different management stream and how that alters the processes. The second question is looking at how state government and local government initiatives can reduce food waste and what state policies have been successful and what we can learn from them. And then the last 2 questions are trying to understand the role of the private sector and nonprofit organizations in reducing food waste. So to answer these 4 questions, I employed a mixed methods approach using both qualitative and quantitative methods to gather information and explore the role of the different sectors. So I started with exploratory interviews to understand how food waste differs from other types of waste and to identify where the gaps are and why we're not seeing results. I then conducted semi-structured interviews with 10 stakeholders working within the private sector, nonprofit organizations, and state and local government to gain a different perspective on what they see as working and what's not working. I then conducted a comparative policy analysis through both interviews and literature reviews of California's edible food recovery policy, so that's one part of SB 1383, which Skylar explained, and then also looking at Massachusetts state policy, their commercial organic waste ban. So I wanted to understand why these 2 strategies are finding success even though they're using very different methods. And then lastly, to further examine policy effectiveness at the local level, I worked alongside Solana Center for Environmental Innovation, which is an environmental nonprofit in San Diego that has been contracted by the city of San Diego to assist in California's SB 1383 implementation. And so they're working through monitoring, compliance, and enforcement. And I used their data, so they had business interactions with many businesses throughout San Diego County that they're contracted to work with. And I used their data from these interactions to analyze the success of the edible food recovery component of SB 1383 at the local level, but also to understand how the Solana Center, a nonprofit, is aiding in the success of this policy. So from my interviews, to answer the first question, I learned that food waste management is much more complex than the management of other waste streams. So the details on here are not super important, but it's just to show that plastic jugs are on top and aluminum cans waste stream is on the bottom. And it's just to show that it's a primarily circular system and very little is ending up in the landfill. And it's a pretty streamlined process. And then I contrasted this with our current food waste management system to show how much more complex it is as there's more actors and more infrastructure needed. And currently in the US, food waste management is not entirely circular. As you can see, most of the food is ending up in the landfill rather than being used to feed humans, animals, and then be recirculated into our soil and onto farms. And so for organic waste management to be entirely circular, it's going to require interaction among more than just the government and these state policies. We need nonprofit organizations, the private sector, to really coordinate. And this is very different than what aluminum cans and plastic jugs require, because this is a much more complicated process. And then to answer the next question, understanding state government leadership, I looked at different state governments that have passed laws and regulatory requirements that either restrict the amount of food waste that can be disposed of in the landfill, or require that food waste generators divert their organic waste. So a few of these state policies have been effective in moving the needle and drawing attention to the problem of food waste. However, very few have found measurable success so far in terms of reducing food waste out of the landfill and consequently lowering methane emissions. So the one that has found success is Massachusetts. Through their commercial organic waste ban that they implemented in 2014, they have successfully diverted food out of their landfill, resulting in a 26% decrease in methane emissions, which is significant. And they attribute their success mostly to aggressive goals that they set initially. They had strong investments in infrastructure. They had very simple parameters so that food-generating businesses could easily comply. And then they had very extensive compliance measures so that everyone was enforced to follow the law. And then California has a slightly different policy that has found some success. I just focused on the edible food recovery component. So Skylar focused on more keeping food out of the landfill, but the edible food recovery component is California had a goal to rescue 20% of its edible surplus food by 2025. And currently we are about 94% of the way, so it's been fairly successful. And so I found that state policies really they're moving the needle, they're changing the dialogue, but them alone is not enough. And I found that in Massachusetts and California, these two examples that are having success, a lot of it is attributed to really strong private sector and nonprofit contributions. So now looking at food waste policies at a more local level, I found through interviews with several nonprofits throughout the US and that nonprofits are really critical for educating food generating businesses. So these are grocery stores and restaurants and wholesalers to increase awareness and draw a link between food waste, climate change, and food insecurity, because this isn't a super obvious link. In addition to education, nonprofits are really important in helping food generating businesses comply with policies through one-on-one assistance or working to match them with a food recovery organization to pick up that food and redistribute it. And then in addition to these interviews, I wanted to understand how nonprofits impact these policies through data. And so this is when I utilized Solana Center's data. They had 320 interactions with businesses throughout San Diego County. And so I use this to understand if they have increased policy compliance over time at the local level. So from interaction notes starting in 2022, I observed that 52% of food generating businesses started with a program in place. So this means that they had a contract with a food recovery organization already in place upon their first time interacting with Solana Center. But since 2022, 120 of these businesses have received multiple interactions with Solana Center through things like an annual inspection, educational outreach, or technical assistance. And as of May of this year, about 70% of these businesses that have interacted with the Solana Center multiple times established a donation program in place. So it's clear that Solana Center is increasing compliance with California's edible recovery component at the local level. And nonprofits like Solana Center are really just crucial in assisting in the compliance of these state policies, because we need both education and one-on-one support for these food generators to be able to successfully comply with these different policies. And there are different organizations throughout California and also Massachusetts that I found in my work that are doing very similar things. And then lastly, to understand the role of the private sector in reducing food waste, I conducted market research and interviews to develop case studies on a few companies that are making a real impact. I found that the private sector is really crucial in managing and reducing food waste due to its economic incentive structure and its unique flexibility to adapt to food businesses' needs, that government and nonprofits don't typically have that same flexibility. In many smaller restaurants and smaller grocery stores, they lack the infrastructure and the resources to comply with certain parts of these policies. And so because of that, many mission-driven companies like Toast and Goodie Bag have focused on economic incentives, such as reducing procurement costs or increasing revenue from surplus sales as the most efficient and effective way to encourage food waste reduction rather than being forced through these policies. So an incredible example of a company working on food waste prevention is Toast. They're a software company that many of us know. They operate throughout restaurants in the US, and they recently created a platform on their software system where restaurants can categorize their food waste throughout the day, and then in return, they get observable trends in their data, so they can adjust vendor orders and reduce costs to stop food waste at the source. So Toast is really focused on preventing food waste, which is really important. And a study found that for every dollar invested in food waste reduction, restaurants can realize about $8 of cost savings. So there really are economic incentives for this change. And then another inspiring company is Goodie Bag, and they're much more focused on the redistribution side of food. And so they've created a marketplace for surplus food by connecting consumers to local shops with unsold food at a discounted price for consumers to then go pick up. And by partnering with Goodie Bag, these restaurants are able to maintain a profit and also avoid food waste at the same time. And in just the last few years, Goodie Bag has prevented over 45,000 bags from being wasted, which is equivalent to about a meal, while also feeding over 11,000 people. And Goodie Bag has found that by pushing economic incentives, it's much more appealing than just showcasing the environmental benefits of preventing food waste. So companies like Toast and Goodie Bag really provide these restaurants and smaller grocery stores with a necessary option for reducing food waste without jeopardizing their financial stability, which is really a win-win for both the business and for the environment. And then just a few concluding thoughts. First of all, food surplus and waste is complex, and it cannot be solved by solely just local and state government intervention. We need engagement and support from all the sectors to create a more circular food system. And lastly, we need to prioritize both prevention and recycling redistribution methods because we can't just do one or the other, we really need both. But these methods and strategies that are working need to be scaled up through greater federal government spending and then allocated to state and local governments and then also nonprofits to introduce more of these state policies and then also be able to strengthen them and help people comply. And then this is just to contrast the current food system. This is an idealized food system where everything it's entirely circular, nothing is ending up in the landfill. And you can see that education is a big part of this. Education needs to be prioritized because that helps with preventing food waste. And then anything that cannot be prevented, so stopped at the source, needs to be used to feed humans through either a reseller program like Goodie Bag or recovered by a food recovery organization. And then anything that can't be fed to humans will be fed to animals or used to compost to then grow more food to create an entirely circular system. But to get there, again, we need greater funding from the US government. There needs to be more education around the issue, and then also more investment is required if we really want to reach the US's goal of having food waste by 2030. I want to thank my capstone committee for their support, Solana Center for Environmental Innovation for their data, CSP leadership, and my cohort. Thanks. Yeah, right there.
Oh, there it is. Did your study look at the biodegradable bags that the companies used to give out for free to put the waste in before it goes into the green bin?
Yeah, I didn't actually look at that at all. I have heard that some of those bags used aren't actually compostable, and it also depends on where that green bin, like the organic waste in the green bin is going. So if it's going to a composting facility, there's different requirements. And if it's going to like an anaerobic digester, there's also different requirements. So I have heard that some of the bags can't actually be composted or there's certain that shouldn't be put into the organic waste bin that are being put in there. So that's a problem, but I didn't go into that in my research at all. So I don't know if the other Skylar knows better, but.
Did you happen to find out anything about the connection with schools and the food at schools? Did the Solana Center, were they part of the business groups that were pulled as part of that? Because they are large generators.
Yeah, so they're incorporated in the food generator. I didn't list them in there, but the Solana Center does work with them and will go in and do inspections on their school to see if they're properly disposing of their organic waste. And help them, they also help these schools connect to a food recovery organization. And they're also doing education outreach. So they count as some of the food generators. And they're very important because there's typically a lot of food around to be either diverted or redistributed.
Hi again. I was wondering if you had any data on methane emissions that were avoided, if Goodie Bag or Toast ever said, you know, our work has prevented X amount of methane emissions?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I asked them the same question, and for Goodie Bag at least, they said they had to be really careful making it like equivalent to methane emissions because their Goodie Bags could be a donut or it could also be like a real meal, and so they had a hard time directly like comparing it to methane emissions, so they just kind of avoided doing that just so that they weren't inaccurate. And that makes sense, but I do think it would be helpful and really impactful for them to have on their website saying that like they've reduced this amount of emissions, but they do have the stats of how many Goodie Bags they've like diverted from hitting the landfill and then also how many people they fed. But yeah, I do think that would be really cool if they were able to compare it.